The black flag returns. It rose not with speeches but with smoke. Not on a battlefield but over a broken village, charred homes, scattered bodies, and silence thick as ash. Somewhere in the northern Sahel, the black flag was raised again. No anthem, no warning. Just a symbol tattered but defiant, billowing in the wind like a curse long forgotten. And now in the shadows of abandoned schools and looted granaries, they whisper one name, Al-Qaeda. Yes, it's back. But here's the question no one dares to ask: who let it in? Was it the failure of the West, the betrayal of African elites, or the silence of those who profit from war? And most of all, can one man stand against it? Before we move deeper into this story, if you care about African truth told by Africans, subscribe to Spirit of Africa. This isn't just news, it's a fight for memory, and memory, like nations, must be defended. On May 27, 2025, a UN field report confirmed what villagers had been saying for weeks. Al-Qaeda's Sahel branch, JNIM, has reclaimed at least 22 key towns across Mali, Niger, and northern Burkina Faso. The death toll over 850 in just 1 month. Schools burned, markets emptied, thousands displaced. Yet the world barely blinks. Western headlines speak of regional instability as if this were a weather forecast, cold, distant, harmless. And while children are buried in unmarked graves, global leaders gather in Paris and Washington to discuss development projects and peace frameworks as though words alone can shield a village from a bullet. But silence, too, is a weapon, and Africa knows this weapon well. The truth: when Ukraine burns, the world sends missiles and billions. When the Sahel burns, it sends statements. This isn't neglect, it's strategy. Because a broken Africa is easier to manage than a free one. And now the question sharpens. If the world won't fight this fire, who will? He should have asked for help. He should have flown to Paris, bowed his head, and begged for troops, for drones, for donations. He should have signed a treaty, attended a summit, shaken the hands of men who see his people as numbers and his land as a spreadsheet. That is what leaders do, isn't it? But Ibrahim Traoré did none of that. Instead, he looked out across the Sahel, not with fear, but with fury. And he made a decision that stunned the world and electrified the streets of Ouagadougou. He would not kneel, he would not beg, he would not trade sovereignty for survival. Because the real fight, he said, was never just against Al-Qaeda. It was against the system that allowed them to grow, against the silent, complicit network of international actors who watched as terrorists moved in and chose not to move a finger. Because a destabilized Sahel is a profitable Sahel. Because chaos invites contracts, and insecurity ensures obedience. So Traoré did the unthinkable. He called the bluff. He withdrew from ECOWAS. He rejected French military bases. He told the IMF to keep its loans and keep its lectures. And in a voice that shook through the region, he declared, "If we die, we will die free." But there's a price for defiance. And the price is isolation. The moment he refused to follow the script, the world wrote him out of theirs. News anchors labeled him a strongman. Analysts said he was in over his head. Diplomats whispered of coups of pressure, of engineered regime change. And while the headlines spoke of security concerns behind closed doors, weapons were being rerouted, not to defend Burkina Faso, but to arm other allies more obedient. And yet Traoré stood firm. He traveled by road to Niger, to Mali, to Guinea. He shook the hands of men who had also chosen resistance. He formed the AES alliance not as a counterweight to the West, but as a declaration that Africa could and must protect itself. In every village he visited, people called him captain of the soil, not just because he wore fatigues, but because he dared to touch the earth that others had sold. And while the Caliphate crept forward with blood and fire, while the global powers watched with folded arms and full pockets, Traoré was digging trenches, not for defense but for cassava, because to him victory would never come from foreign bombs, it would come from African roots. But is that enough? Can one man, one captain truly hold the line against an ideology soaked in fanaticism and fed by foreign neglect? Can a movement of farmers and villagers, soldiers and students truly resist a hydra that regenerates in every broken system the empire leaves behind? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions millions of Africans are asking right now. And for many of them, especially the youth, Traoré is not just an answer. He is the question itself. He forces us to confront what we've accepted for too long, that dependence is safety, that obedience is smart, that freedom must wait until we are ready. But what if we are ready now? What if the enemy at our gates is not just Al-Qaeda, but the idea that we are too weak, too divided, too poor to stand without permission? What if the fire in the Sahel is not just a crisis, but a cleansing, a fire that burns, illusions, burns, lies, burns, the false choice between fear and freedom, because in the ashes something is growing. And if you look closely, you will see it sprouting in the fields Traoré reclaimed. You will see it in the students learning under trees, not waiting for foreign aid to build schools. You will see it in the volunteers joining the VDPs, not as mercenaries but as defenders of a dream. You will see it in the way mothers whisper his name like a prayer, and the way elders nod as if they've seen this spirit before long ago in stories they were told not to believe. You will see it in the silence of the West. Because when they stop mocking you and start fearing your example, you know you're onto something real. So no, Traoré is not alone, not anymore. He is the first candle in a house full of dry wood, and if he burns with truth, the whole house may light up. They didn't knock on the door, they didn't wave a flag or send a warning. They came like a whisper in the wind, like a shadow crawling back into a land that had just begun to heal. In the north, villagers whispered of strange men in flowing robes, men who offered justice but came with guns, who offered purity but demanded obedience, who promised paradise but delivered ash and blood. Al-Qaeda, it seemed, was no longer hiding. It was recruiting, not in caves but in classrooms abandoned by corrupt regimes, not in deserts but in towns forgotten by donor budgets, not with bombs but with Bibles rewritten in bullets and Qurans drenched in cruelty. This was not the Al-Qaeda of 2001. This was the mutation shaped by failed aid, broken governments, and the silence of the so-called international community. And in this vacuum, this black hole left by fake democracies and foreign betrayal, the Caliphate saw an opportunity. It began quietly. A market in Djibo taken over, a radio station in Gorom broadcasting new laws, roads declared off limits unless a tax was paid, not to the state but to the jihad. They banned music, they burned books, they forced young girls into marriages that were little more than state-sanctioned rape. And for every act of horror there was a justification. We are the law now. Your government failed you. Your president is a puppet of the West. It was psychological warfare as much as physical. And the worst part, some believed them. Because when a child has never seen a school, when a village hasn't seen a clinic in years, when soldiers come only to arrest and never to protect, then even tyranny starts to look like order. And in the minds of the desperate, order is seductive. But Traoré understood something the world didn't. He knew this wasn't just a military invasion. It was a war for imagination, a war for the soul of Africa. So he didn't just send troops, he sent ideas. He didn't just deploy the army, he deployed the farmers. He deployed the poets. He deployed the youth with phones, with songs, with stories. Because if Al-Qaeda's weapon was despair, then Burkina Faso's weapon had to be dignity. And he made a strategic choice few understood. He didn't beg for UN peacekeepers. He didn't invite in private security firms. He didn't privatize protection. He built the VDPs, the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland. And they weren't just men with guns. They were grandmothers. They were teachers. They were teenagers. Ordinary people turned into an extraordinary wall. Not perfect, not polished, but proud. And while the West called them militias, the people called them our last hope. Because when foreign embassies shut down and NGOs evacuated to air-conditioned hotels in Accra, it was the VDPs who stayed. It was the farmers who kept planting. It was the mothers who refused to run. And that's what shook the Caliphate. Not the bullets, but the refusal to bow. But the war isn't over. Reports are growing of sleeper cells along the Niger border. Drone footage shows training camps camouflaged in the Sahel brush. Foreign fighters speaking Arabic, French, and even English slipping in through abandoned trade routes once patrolled by ECOWAS, but now left open as sanctions suffocate the AES. And the irony: the very countries that claim to fight terrorism are now punishing the nations that actually are. France pulls out its troops, but keeps its grip on uranium. The US cuts aid, but sends advisors to neighboring regimes who still kneel on command. So who's helping whom? And who's truly afraid? Because Traoré may have flaws, he may be brash, he may be young, but he's doing something no one else dares. He's fighting terror without surrendering sovereignty. And that is dangerous. Not for Burkina Faso, but for the system. Because if one country proves you can stand alone, then others may try. If one leader shows you can resist both the Caliphate and the colonizers, then the entire map may shift. So the pressure is mounting, not just from the gunmen in the dunes, but from the suits in Brussels, from the boardrooms of the World Bank, from the editorial pages of Paris. And yet he does not fold, because this is not just a war for territory. It is a war for meaning. Do we define Africa as a playground for empire, or as a continent finally writing its own story? Do we let the Caliphate steal our children, or do we show them that true power comes from planting, not punishing? Do we wait for help, or do we become the help? These are the questions Traoré is answering with action. And every answer makes both the terrorists and the technocrats tremble. So as the Caliphate rises again from the dust, and the old empire watches from behind its curtain, a new force is rising too. One not built in bunkers but in belief. The Caliphate may be rising in the Sahel, but the real battlefield is Paris. Not in its streets, but behind its polished doors. Not with bombs, but with memos. Not with AK-47s, but with gas contracts and media narratives. Because what truly threatens France today is not just the gunfire in Djibo, it is the silence of its allies, the crumbling of its influence, and the laughter echoing from Ouagadougou, where a young captain dares to say no, and worse, he says it publicly. "We don't need your money to rise," he told the world. "We just need to be left alone." To Western ears, it was blasphemy. To the empire, it was rebellion. And rebellion is contagious. Because once Mali said none, and Niger followed with Jamais plus, and Burkina Faso drew the final line in the sand, the myth of French control in Africa began to unravel faster than any coup could trigger. No, this wasn't just a diplomatic headache, this was humiliation. So they called it terrorism. They painted the AES alliance as unstable. They ran editorials in Le Monde and The Economist about democratic backsliding and populist militarism. But what they never admitted was fear. Fear that Traoré had found a weak spot in the empire, that France, for all its military bases and embassies, no longer had the hearts of the people. Because how do you rule a continent that has stopped believing your lies? And as the French elite whispered behind oak doors, trying to find new partners, new moderates, new technocratic solutions. Their old puppet strings were snapping, fast. The government of Chad started holding secret meetings with Russian advisors. Guinea began reassessing its loan agreements. Even Senegal's youth started chanting Traoré's name in the markets of Dakar. This wasn't Pan-Africanism as theory. This was Pan-Africanism as wildfire, and the empire was scrambling for water. But their hands held only oil. The more they tried to push their agenda through ECOWAS sanctions, through media blackouts, through diplomatic isolation, the more the streets of Bobo Dioulasso filled with art resistance and conviction. Meanwhile, inside France, a quiet panic began to grow. Not on TV, not in parliament, but in the offices of Total Energies, in the halls of the Defense Ministry, in the boardrooms of mining conglomerates whose profits depended on the silence of African presidents. And now, that silence had turned into song. A dangerous defiance song, with a rhythm called sovereignty. So they turned to NATO, they whispered into Washington's ear, they warned of extremism, Russian-influenced Chinese expansion. They threw every card on the table except the truth that for decades they fed fat off uranium from Niger gold, from Burkina cotton, from Mali, while giving back lectures, not electricity, reports, not respect. And now that their feeding bowl was overturned, they cried foul. But here's the twist. Even within France, resistance was growing. French youth began questioning their country's legacy in Africa. African diaspora students staged sit-ins at Sciences Po. Protesters marched in Marseille demanding, "Why do we still control currencies that aren't ours?" It was no longer just an African awakening, it was a reckoning. Because truth has a funny way of echoing. What begins in Ouagadougou doesn't stay in Ouagadougou. It travels through song, through WhatsApp, through podcasts and poetry. It crosses oceans. It lands in Harlem, in Soweto, in Port-au-Prince, and suddenly France realized it wasn't just losing territory, it was losing the narrative. And in empire, once you lose the story, you lose everything. Traoré knew this. That's why he didn't just speak to Burkina Faso, he spoke to Africa and beyond. He said, "We are not poor, we are plundered. We are not backward, we are blocked. We are not asking for permission. We are taking back what is ours." These weren't just slogans, they were spells, undoing centuries of mental colonization. And that's what scared the empire most. Not the bullets, not the boycotts, but the clarity, the unbearable clarity of a young man with no fear in his eyes, who speaks as if he's already won, because in many ways he has. He has shown Africa a mirror. And once a people sees their true reflection, they cannot go back to being shadows. So as the Caliphate builds bunkers, and France builds narratives, Traoré builds something else. A resistance that doesn't look like resistance. It looks like cassava farms. It looks like community radios. It looks like children learning history, not written in Paris. And slowly, quietly, it looks like victory. They thought he would beg. They thought, like so many before him, he would kneel quietly, take the deal signed, the paper smile for the cameras, and disappear into the machinery of compromise. But Ibrahim Traoré refused. And in that refusal, something extraordinary began to happen. Burkina Faso, for decades treated as a land of scarcity and crisis, started turning into something else. A place of imagination, a place of defiance, a place of ideas. Children in Kaya now learn history from textbooks written in their own languages. Farmers in Tenkodogo are trading seeds, not slogans. Radio stations in Gawa broadcast poetry about freedom, not fear. And in the capital, you no longer hear the word dependency. You hear dignity. No, the empire didn't expect that. Because to them, dignity was not a budget item. It couldn't be measured in dollars. It couldn't be loaned, leased, or licensed. So they never planned for it. But Traoré did. He understood what too many leaders forgot, that sovereignty is not just political, it's spiritual, that freedom is not granted by contracts, it is affirmed in consciousness. And now that consciousness is spreading. The miracle is not that Burkina Faso stood up. The miracle is that it stood up and did not fall back down. And it didn't require perfection, it required courage. In a world where leaders sell out their nations for UN speeches and donor applause, Burkina Faso said, "We will plant our own food. We will build with our own hands. We will teach our own children. We will define our own destiny, not because it is easy, but because it is ours." That right there is the quiet miracle they won't report on CNN. It's the revolution you won't find in IMF white papers, because it doesn't fit their metrics, but it fits the soul of a continent that has bled long enough. And maybe, just maybe, that's why you're still here listening, watching, hoping. Because deep down you know this isn't just about Burkina Faso. This is about what happens when the unbowed refuse to be erased. So if these words move, you don't scroll past. Like, comment, subscribe. Be part of the story, because the world will ignore this if we let them. But if we speak together loud enough, they can't. There comes a moment in every nation's journey where silence becomes betrayal. A moment when neutrality is not peace, but permission. That moment is now. Because what we are witnessing in Burkina Faso is not just a geopolitical standoff. It is a test of Africa's soul. They are circling again. The warlords with Western accents. The black flags stitched in foreign embroidery. The old deals signed in Paris, smoke-filled rooms. And they all want the same thing. A return to the predictable. A return to control. But Traoré has drawn a line. Not with missiles. Not with speeches, with memory. He remembers Sankara. He remembers Lumumba. He remembers how they tried to erase dignity by putting a bullet through hope. But this time, he dares them. Because this time the youth are watching. The farmers are awake. The soldiers have chosen soil over salary, and the women who've carried the burden of war on their backs now stand at the front of the story, not as victims but as visionaries. The line is simple. You can threaten us, you can surround us, but you will not own us. This is not about Islam, not about terrorism, not even about foreign policy. This is about a people who have tasted sovereignty and will not give it up. They may call Traoré a target. They may label him a destabilizer, but we know better. Because what threatens them is not his army, it's his example. A black nation small but unbreakable, poor on paper but rich in purpose, alone in geography but united in spirit. And that is the line. That is the fire that no drone strike can extinguish, the one that burns in the hearts of every African who refuses to kneel again. So ask yourself this: will you watch in silence as the old empires redraw the maps, or will you rise, speak, share, resist? Because this time the world must hear us not as whispers but as thunder. Comment, share. Let your voice be the weapon they can't silence. Let the algorithm know we are not afraid. We are not alone. We are awake. And that, my brothers and sisters, is the line that cannot be crossed.